Welcome to today's deep dive. We are getting into something today that basically fundamentally rewrites the traditional script on good, evil, and, the ultimate adversary.
Yeah, it really flips the whole concept on its head.
It does. We are unpacking a highly specific and really intricate theological framework today. It's laid out in a series of documents titled The Divine Purpose of Satan and the Testing of Man.
Right, and these are some really fascinating excerpts from the International Congregation of Lord Rael. Specifically, they were authored by an entity or an individual known as Domini.
And we're looking at writings published across two different periods, 2020 and 2022.
Exactly.
Hmm?
And collectively, they build this very cohesive, albeit entirely unorthodox worldview.
Yeah, unorthodox is definitely the word. But before we get into the weeds here, we really need to set a quick ground rule for you, the listener, for today's deep dive.
Absolutely. This is crucial.
We are looking at highly specific, deeply held religious doctrines. And as your host, our job is not to validate or endorse or take sides on these theological views.
Right. We are strictly here as your guides.
Exactly. We're just mapping out the architecture of a very provocative worldview contained in these specific sources so you can understand exactly how it works.
We are looking at the blueprint of a belief system here. We are not trying to sell you the house.
I love that way of putting it. And the foundation of this particular house is built on just a massive paradigm shift regarding one of the most infamous figures in human history.
It really asks a simple but absolutely staggering question.
What if the devil wasn't a cosmic enemy rebelling in absolute chaos against God?
Right, because the traditional narrative you usually hear is all about this epic, chaotic war in heaven.
Good versus evil, light versus dark. But Domini's texts reframe the adversary as a loyal subordinate, like someone doing a terribly grim but completely necessary job to actually help humanity progress.
It's a huge shift. And to see how the 2020 document arrives at that conclusion, we really have to start with the linguistics.
Okay, let's unpack this. The original source material begins by just defining the word Satan.
And it doesn't define it as, a fiery monster with a pitchfork.
No, the literal translation they offer is an adversary, one who resists, or the accuser.
And that naturally leads to looking at how often that specific word actually shows up in the ancient texts.
Which is wild because if you asked the average person on the street, they would probably guess the Old Testament is just absolutely packed with mentions of Satan.
Oh, for sure. But the numbers tell a remarkably different story.
Right.
When you look through the analytical lens provided by Domini, the word Satan appears a grand total of 18 times in the Old Testament.
Just 18 times. That is...
Yeah, and 14 of those occurrences are concentrated entirely in the book of Job, specifically just the first two chapters.
Wow.
The remaining 4 appearances are split between 1 Chronicles 21, verse 1, and Zechariah chapter 3.
18 times. I mean, for a figure that absolutely dominates modern cultural consciousness and literature and cinema, that is an incredibly small scriptural footprint.
It really is. It forces a complete reevaluation of what the ancient authors were actually trying to communicate.
Yeah.
And the 2020 text highlights a major dispute among scholars regarding the grammar of those 18 appearances.
The grammar.
Yeah, the debate hinges on whether Satan is a proper name, like David or Sarah, or if it functions as a job title.
Wait, a job title? If it's a title and not a name, that changes the entire nature of the character we are talking about.
Exactly. It takes a lot of the inherent malice out of the identity.
Right, because a title implies a role.
The source points out that in the book of Job and in Zechariah, the Hebrew noun is actually preceded by a definite article.
So in the original language, it literally translates to the Satan or the accuser.
Yes. Because of that definite article, it functions grammatically as a title or a role being filled.
But then
in 1 Chronicles, there is no definite article, which leaves room for some to argue it is used as a proper name in that isolated instance.
Okay, so in the vast majority of its appearances, we are looking at a designated role.
That's the argument, yeah.
And Domini's writings assert that in the Old Testament, the accuser is not an evil principle opposing God at all.
Not at all. He acts as a subordinate, a courtier in the divine court, strictly following directives.
If you read the early chapters of Job with that framework in mind, Satan isn't this independent warlord crashing the gates of heaven. He's literally part of the assembly.
The text specifically notes that the tempting and testing and tormenting of Job is done under angelic observance, and crucially, with absolute divine permission.
That is such a wild concept to wrap your head around.
It is.
But when you view the adversary as an auditor rather than an enemy general, it forces a massive emotional shift.
Okay.
I mean, think about a corporate auditor for a second. An auditor walks into a company, scrutinizes every email, stress tests the accounting systems, and makes life generally miserable for all the employees.
And not the most popular people in the office.
Exactly. You might dread the auditor. You might even deeply resent the auditor when they point out a critical flaw in your department.
But the auditor doesn't hate the company. They work for the CEO. Their job is to find the weak points before the company collapses under real-world pressure.
And Domini's 2020 text visualizes the adversary in this exact light. Satan is there to audit humanity.
The source notes that the general public fears or hates this entity simply because they just don't comprehend his usefulness in the grand scheme of human progression.
And mainstream Christianity has historically approached the devil with that kind of blind hatred. But the Raelite perspective highlighted in Domini's writings takes a totally different, almost uncomfortable approach.
They advocate for sympathy.
Yeah, sympathy.
What's fascinating here is that this is perhaps the most jarring theological pivot in the entire document. The idea of sympathizing with the accuser.
It's a lot to ask of someone.
It is. But according to this worldview, Satan is burdened with doing what he must do. It is an agonizing, terrible role, but one that is fundamentally required for the system to work.
The followers of this congregation understand the heavy psychological and spiritual burden of that necessary job.
It's moving from fear and hatred to this grim understanding of cosmic mechanics.
It really requires a lot of cognitive dissonance to look at the ultimate source of human temptation and feel sympathy for the weight of their divine assignment.
Absolutely.
And this perspective isn't just isolated to a quirky reading of the Old Testament. The source material pulls this framework right through into the New Testament as well.
It maintains that consistency by asserting that Satan and his demons are ultimately obedient to God's Son, Yeshua.
So they are still in the chain of command.
Exactly. The text doesn't deny the fall of these entities, but it makes a critical distinction. Even in their fallen state, they continue to operate entirely under God's unchanging law.
They haven't escaped the jurisdiction of the Creator.
No, they are still bound by the rules of the system. They are placed in positions that God finds necessary for mankind's progression.
So they are still executing the audit, just in a different capacity.
That's the idea.
But if we follow that logic to its natural conclusion, we hit a massive wall with traditional teachings. We all know the mandate from Yeshua to love your neighbor and pray for your persecutors.
Right.
But Domini's writings push that to a staggering extreme. The source material argues we should apply this teaching even to demons.
To love and pray for demons.
Yes.
It is a radical application of empathy. The text justifies this by stating that even though we experience them as our enemy, they were still God's purposeful creations.
That phrase, purposeful creations, is doing a lot of heavy lifting there.
It really is.
It implies that demons are not accidents, and they aren't some mistake in the cosmic code that God is scrambling to fix.
They are a feature, not a bug.
Right.
And this leads directly into the core philosophy of human progression within the Raelite text, the absolute necessity of testing.
Okay, let's get into that.
The writings argue that without the demons and without the specific tools of temptation afforded to them, mankind would remain an untested and therefore unworthy being.
Because you cannot prove your worth in a vacuum. If you never face temptation, you haven't actually chosen righteousness. You have just existed in a state of default neutrality.
The fundamental assertion is that humanity is unfit for whatever comes next, the kingdom, the next level of progression, without being proven in the crucible of difficulty.
Difficulties aren't random, chaotic punishments.
No, they are the required proving ground.
It's like the ultimate spiritual gym.
I like that analogy.
Think about it. A muscle absolutely cannot grow without the resistance of heavy weights. If you go to the gym and just lift your arms in the air, you aren't building strength.
You're just doing cardio.
Right. You need the grueling, painful resistance of the iron to actually tear the muscle fibers down so they can adapt and grow stronger.
And according to this framework, the human spirit cannot become fit for the kingdom without the grueling resistance of darkness.
The demons are literally the heavyweights on the barbell.
That captures the mechanics perfectly.
Yeah.
And the text expands on the metaphysical value of this dynamic too. It discusses the nature of light itself.
How so?
Well, the darkness that demons represent and that they manifest in our world exists purposefully to contrast with the light.
Like how you cannot truly appreciate or even perceive the stars without the black backdrop of the night sky.
Exactly. The writings explicitly state that without this darkness, which, again, it reiterates, is a creative manifestation from God,
Mhm.
the world we know and the light we uphold would have a vastly diminished value.
And to anchor this perspective, the source material pulls directly from the Jewish Publication Society's translation of Isaiah chapter 45, verse 7.
That's a very specific and important verse.
It phrases the concept very pointedly. It says, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I am the Lord that doeth all these things.
I make peace and create evil.
Yeah,
That single line from Isaiah is the bedrock of the theological framework we are discussing today.
it establishes absolute sovereignty.
Yes. It entirely removes the idea of dualism, the concept of two equal, opposing forces fighting this cosmic tug-of-war for control of the universe.
The good guy and the bad guy arm wrestling.
Right. Instead, God is the author of the entire system, the light and the dark, the peace and the testing. Even the adversary serves the ultimate design.
All right, so Domini's text establishes that the tests are necessary, the adversary is a divine auditor providing resistance, and God is at the top of the chain of command.
Correct.
But the writings do not sugarcoat the experience of actually going through this. The text pivots into some incredibly grim warnings about just how intense overcoming these tests can be.
It shifts from the philosophical why to the incredibly urgent how.
Yeah.
Because if you understand the system, the real question is, how do you actually survive the audit?
And to illustrate the stakes, the text shares a passage from the New Testament, pulling from the NIT translation of Mark chapter 9, verses 43 through 48.
And the imagery here is incredibly visceral.
It is. It says, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It's better to enter eternal life with only one hand than to go into the unquenchable fires of hell with two hands.
And it repeats this for the foot and the eye.
Right. Concluding that it's better to enter the kingdom of God maimed than to be thrown into hell, quote, where the maggots never die and the fire never goes out.
It is deeply horrifying language.
It really is.
And the 2020 text notes that this exact same warning is repeated almost verbatim in two other places, Matthew 18 and Matthew 5.
Now, when you hear that as a listener, the immediate question is about literal interpretation.
Naturally.
Is this theology advocating for physical self-mutilation to pass the test?
No, and the source material explicitly clarifies that it is not.
Okay, good.
Domini argues that this dire warning, given by Christ 2 millennia ago, was never designed to encourage literal self-mutilation.
It serves as an extreme hyperbole to cut through human complacency.
Exactly. The text decodes the violence of the language. It argues the purpose was to make the stakes straightforward and totally unforgettable.
Because people tend to brush off gentle warnings.
Right. It was about communicating the absolute paramount importance of passing the tests that Satan puts in front of people.
The ultimate lesson, according to the writings, is about the true cost of sacrifice.
Yes.
It is the realization that absolutely nothing, not your livelihood, not your comforts, not your literal hand or eye, should be considered too much to sacrifice if you truly understand what is at stake.
The resistance is necessary to grow, but failing the final test has catastrophic consequences.
And this brings us to the urgent present-day application of these texts.
This is where it gets very immediate.
Because the excerpts we are exploring do not treat these warnings as ancient history or just metaphors for some distant future.
No, the 2022 Domini text pulls these concepts directly into the current moment.
It pivots to the book of Revelation, specifically quoting Revelation 13, verse 7 from the Berean Standard Bible.
And what does that say?
It reads, Then the beast was permitted to wage war against the saints and to conquer them, and it was given authority over every tribe and people and tongue and nation.
I want you to pay attention to the phrasing there.
Yeah.
Permitted to wage war.
There it is again.
Once again, we see that recurring theme of permission.
A subordinate operating within allowed parameters to enact a severe global test.
Exactly. And the 2022 text uses this scripture to issue a massive wake-up call to the followers of Lord Rael.
It urgently warns that the prophesied final testing of the saints is not a hypothetical event looming on the horizon.
No.
The text declares that this time of final testing is entirely upon us right now.
Because this final testing is currently active, the source material commands its readers not to become weak or complacent in their resolve.
They can't afford to be.
Right. It implores them to let those grim warnings about unquenchable fires and ultimate sacrifice ring louder in their ears now than ever before.
It is a high-stakes, high-pressure worldview. I mean, the auditor is in the building, the final exam is sitting on the desk, and the consequences for failing are eternal.
It demands a level of vigilance fundamentally different from a casual view of good versus evil.
The believer has to recognize the utility of the darkness while simultaneously fighting with everything they have to overcome it.
It requires you to hold two very difficult concepts in your mind at once. You have to appreciate the design of the test while fiercely battling the tester.
Which is incredibly complex, but examining such radically different perspectives is incredibly valuable.
It really is. In a world full of information overload, taking the time to understand a framework that completely challenges our baseline assumptions.
It forces us to think more critically about how belief systems are constructed.
Exactly.
Well, we have covered some serious ground today, so let's briefly recap the journey of this deep dive.
We started by dissecting the grammatical title of the accuser.
Right, looking at how the presence of a definite article in ancient Hebrew shifts Satan from a proper name to a job title.
And then we explored the concept of God deliberately creating darkness and utilizing adversaries to rigorously test humanity.
Much like a corporate auditor or heavyweights in a gym.
And we culminated in the urgent warnings of the 2020 and 2022 Rail 8 texts,
which argue that the final, most grueling tests are happening right now, demanding absolute sacrifice and unwavering resolve.
Now, as a final reminder to you, our listener, our role today was simply to serve as your guides through the theology of the International Congregation of Lord Rail.
Yes, we explored the architecture of these ideas to help you unpack the source material clearly and objectively.
Without endorsing the religious doctrines themselves.
Right.
But keeping that architecture in mind, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Lay it on us.
If, according to the framework we just explored, absolute deliberate resistance is required for humans to become worthy,
yeah,
how might our everyday perception of personal obstacles, hardships, and even our so-called enemies change if we viewed them not as random setbacks, but as custom-designed tests necessary to prove our ultimate value?
Man, that changes the entire context of a bad day, doesn't it?
And it really does.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.